the US, who is a private body. The government cannot say you must recognize. And it's state by state, one for New York State, one for Oregon, and so on. Same for doctors. So even if they're open to people, number one, you don't get your qualifications recognized. You don't get a visa. Visa is not part of it. You have a right to work with no visa and no qualifications. So it's not a very good way for Malaysians who think they're going to get jobs overseas to get jobs. And then the question about the migrant workers' rights comes in under the Labour Consistency Plan. But in the US, one of the reasons they do not open to foreign workers is because in the US Constitution, it is the Congress, the Parliament, who has the right to do immigration, not the Trade Ministry who negotiates the TPP. And when the US Trade Ministry tried to give visas in the Chile and Singapore US FTAs, they got a tight slap from Congress. You must not do this, unconstitutional, never do it again. So they cannot lie, and they have not. So that might cover that issue.
You mentioned something on Edward Snowden's leak.
Yeah, I forgot. Edward Snowden, thank you. So there is a whole chapter called e-commerce, which has various things in it in the TPP. But one of the things that the US cloud computing companies, your Google, your Dropbox, your, I don't know, iTunes, whoever who stores your data on the cloud, they just want to have one server storing all your data in the whole world at the cheapest place for electricity. They don't want to have one in every country, right? Very troublesome for them. So in the TPP, the e-commerce chapter, the general rule is you must allow cross-border data flows. You must allow the Malaysian sensitive health, finance, tax records of Malaysian citizens to go out of Malaysia to be stored anywhere in the world, even if those countries have no privacy laws, even if they sell your private data to insurers and to advertisers and the US government can walk in and take it like Snowden showed us in the US. Too bad. You have to let it go out. And I think today in Malaysia there is a PDPA, Personal Data Privacy Something Act, right? Which says that the Malaysian personal data must be stored in Malaysia or basically Singapore. In the TPP you have to let it go out, even to the US. Now there are some attempted exceptions. There's an attempted privacy exception, but again it uses that wording they borrowed from the WTO that makes it so hard to use, 1 out of 44 success rate. And you could schedule exceptions. You could try and ask for exceptions if all the other countries agreed. But from memory, Malaysia didn't ask for any of those exceptions. So I don't know what happened to the PDPA, I think gone already. So the Malaysian, you basically locks in the ability of the US government to spy on Malaysian data. The Australian government tried to get an exception to this because TTIP, the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, the EU is very privacy minded. And the Australians think that maybe the EU will get an exception, and then the Australians want the same exception as the EU. But Malaysia didn't ask for that or didn't get that. So basically, the e-commerce chapter also prevents you from requiring the data to be stored locally, where, for example, in Australia, if you go to your doctor, your general practitioner, and he takes down your health records and he stores it on the cloud electronically, that cloud must be in Australia to make sure that Australian privacy laws apply to your health data. Cannot be a cloud somewhere in some country with no privacy laws. That requirement for local storage is not allowed. No local storage requirement for data unless you got the exception. Unless you trust that 1 out of 44 privacy exception. So the e-commerce chapter basically locks in the right for the US government to keep doing spying the way Edward Snowden showed us the NSA is doing. So that's also going to be part of what Malaysia signs on the 4th of February and what goes to the Malaysian Parliament on the 26th of January.
Can I ask expand on the ISP?
ISP liability? Internet service provider? Okay, so that one I have to check the latest version of the text. So generally, internet service providers are your, you can explain it better than me. They're like telco companies, right? The ones who give you internet access, and they might host your website. So maybe I am hooked up with Telecom Malaysia and they give me storage space, right? And I can put a website where I put my grandma's favorite recipes, and I put my favorite songs and my book reviews or something. So internet service providers, the US basically has their own Digital Millennium Copyright Act where they want to make sure that if anything infringing, copyright infringing goes on the website, it's taken down. So for example, if on my website I have copied a recipe from somebody and I'm infringing copyright, then it has to be taken down. The same if I put up on the YouTube, I put up a illegal copy of a song or a movie or something. But what has happened in the US is that this has been abused. So for example, there was a famous case where an economics lecturer, whose name I think was like Professor West, he put his economics lecturer podcast on the internet so his students who couldn't make it to the lecture could hear it online. So it was like west.mp3. So the music companies and the movie companies have bots, they have software that crawls across the web automatically, looking for infringing copies of the songs and the movies. Then when they find one, the software automatically turns this into a letter sent to the internet service provider saying, take down, that is a copyright infringing copy of the music or the movie. And if you don't, we know we will fine you and so on. So of course they looked at this, west.mp3, and they thought, Kanye West song, take it down. So without any human being looking at it and intervening, the software generated a letter, sent it to the fella, the university took it down. By the time they challenged and put it back up, the economics exam had finished, and the students couldn't get it. Because nobody actually checked, this is an economics lecture, it's not a song. And this is often abused by companies, because there was another famous case where it was a driving school, learning to drive in Britain, I think, and they had a list of the suburbs or towns where they have people who can teach you to drive. And then there was another company who also went to the same towns. So the first guy said, I have copyright on that list of towns. You have infringed my copyright because you have the same list. Take down your website. And then the competitor's website is down. I get all the business. So most of the takedown notices are businesses taking down each other's hotel websites, or even the movie studios taking down bad reviews that they don't like because they say infringing copyright. So Google has a lot of statistics on this, and basically the internet service provider can get thousands of these notices because they're automatically generated by the software. And then a copyright lawyer has to look at each one and say, is this really a Kanye West song? Is it infringing? Maybe it's fair use, maybe it's satire, or maybe I've translated it, or maybe it's a short excerpt. And the copyright lawyer has to assess each run. Then they have to decide whether it's takedown or not, if it's infringing or not. So it's very costly for the internet service provider, because if they don't, they can be sued. So this was the general gist of what the US wanted in the TPP to protect their Hollywood guys and their music studios from infringing stuff on the internet. They shift the burden to the internet service provider to do the enforcement. In the end, I think there was a lot of resistance from countries, and I'm not sure in the end if the internet service provider provision is as bad as I described. Maybe we can talk afterwards, we can look, because I think it got watered down for some countries, and I'm not sure for Malaysia or not. But that's the gist of what the US wanted, and then I don't know where it ended up, finally. Sorry. Somebody else? Okay. I think some people had sent some questions. I'm just trying to find, I want to make sure I cover those too. Is there any other sectors I haven't covered? Please.
Well, is there an example of in the past where the country gets you to play disobedience, like what would be like if, let's say, because people know that it's injustice is playing around, let's say the one country just made it, you should be, I won't pay.
Yes. So, there's a few different stages to this. So I counted, and there were about 60 countries, 60, who start negotiating a free trade agreement with the US. Always very optimistic. I will get a good deal. My Prime Minister is special friends with the US President, goes to his ranch for barbecue. I will get a special deal. That's what the Australian thought, Australian Prime Minister. He got the same deal as everybody else, the same text, because the US has a template, you sign here. So a lot of countries, after 25 rounds of negotiations, where they have not succeeded in making any significant change to the initial US template that came, they look at the final version, they say, you know what, this doesn't suit my country. For national interest, thank you, but no thank you, I won't sign. And this is what Switzerland did. Switzerland was negotiating a US free trade agreement. They looked at it after 2 or 3 rounds. They said to the US, must you have this on intellectual property and agriculture? US said, we must. It's our red line. Switzerland said, thanks, but no thanks. Let's stay friends, but we don't need this free trade agreement. We can continue to trade with each other under the World Trade Organization, where we all have low tariffs. Let's just carry on without it. So out of the 60 countries who started negotiating, 20 signed. 2/3 walked away because it didn't suit them. So the majority don't start negotiating, and of those who negotiate, 2/3 don't sign because it's so bad for them. Very few sign. Very few can cope with the substance of what the US insists on. Once they've signed and it comes into force, then what happens if they don't comply? So remember state-to-state dispute settlement for most of the chapters. So say you don't give the longer patents or the longer copyrights. The US government can sue you, can sue Malaysian government at an international tribunal. Malaysia would lose, and the tariffs, the taxes, the US tariffs on Malaysian exports would be raised until Malaysia changes its law to comply. So the palm oil, the electronics, the baju, everything, pays a higher tariff, they lose market share in the US until Malaysia changes its law, its constitution, whatever is violating. So it becomes very enforceable, and most countries cannot withstand that pressure. Once there are tariff sanctions, they say, okay, I agree. The US and EU actually can withstand. There are some famous cases where I think the US sued the EU because of the EU regulations on GMOs or on beef hormones, and the EU lost. But the EU said, never mind, this is so important for my health, I don't care lah. America, you keep your 100%, 1000% tariffs on French cheese, never mind, I keep my laws. They could tahan because they are rich lah. But can Malaysia tahan if its exporters are screaming, the palm oil, the electronics, all facing tariffs? Most countries say, okay, I change my law to comply. Investor-to-state dispute settlement, so to enforce the investment chapter, the US investor can sue the Malaysian government if they don't comply. And remember that that one is binding on all levels of government. So say the PJ government doesn't comply and they ban something that is not allowed to be banned. The Malaysian national, federal government gets sued by the US company. The national government must defend. And sometimes they say, I don't want to defend very hard. This is some other political party's policy in this state of this, not my political party, why should I defend his action? Or they make them pay. They say, the state, it's your fault. You pay my legal fees, $8 million, $50 million to defend because it's your fault, you broke the law. Then the national government is defending, hard or not hard, we see. Then they lose, and they have to pay the $50 billion to the foreign investor. If they don't pay under the TPP, the home country of the investor, the US government, can raise the tariffs, the taxes on Malaysia's exports until it pays the $50 billion to the American investor. So double enforcement. Then say the Malaysian national government, the federal government pays the $50 billion. They turn around to say to PJ, it was your fault, you banned this fella. So can he get the money back from the PJ government or the Penang state government? And it depends on each country's law. In Canada, the provinces kept violating, and the national government kept getting sued and kept paying, and they got sick of it. And they said, next time provinces, you pay. So now the provinces are having to pay when they ban a mine, for example, and they got sued and they lost and they settled, whatever, they paid. But in Mexico, the same thing happened. The Mexican local government and state government banned a toxic waste dump because it was going to pollute the water supply which people were drinking. The national government got sued. They lost. They had to pay $16 million to the investor. The national government sued the local and state governments in the Mexican courts under Mexican law. So give me back the $16 million I paid because your fault. Under Mexican constitution, they could not get the money back. So it's interesting consequences both ways, right? Because if the national government is responsible for the state governments, who are a different political party, who under the constitution have some things that are state rights, right? Federal list, state list, concurrent list, only states can do this. The national government cannot control the fella, but he's liable. That's one version. The other version may be in Malaysia, he can withhold the allotments, withhold the discretionary spending on highways that he was going to give the state and force him to pay it back. If that's the case, then the federal government on the 4th of February will be signing on behalf of all the state governments and all the local governments, including PJ, and binding them in those chapters and making them liable because the federal government will get the money back from them. So have they all been informed? Have they all been consulted? Did they realize? Have they set aside in their budget money to pay the legal fees, the damages, the compound interest? Because they will all be on the hook once the TPP starts, because the federal government is signing on their behalf on the 4th of February. And I understand in Malaysia there is some discretion where the federal government can hold back money from, say, Penang in the allotments or in the highway funding or something. So it looks like in Malaysia politically, the federal government can say, it's your fault, I'm going to hold back your money. Now the state doesn't get the money or whatever. So it's a bit complicated, but generally.
Once you sign, can you opt out?
Yes, so this is a good question. So in the TPP, you can withdraw with what they say is 6 months notice in writing. So Malaysia just writes a letter, 6 months later it takes effect, you are out. But there has never been a country that has withdrawn from a US free trade agreement once it takes effect. Because politically it might look a bit unfriendly. I'm not friending you anymore, right? I'm withdrawing. And some things are a bit irreversible. If your patients have died with no medicines, you cannot bring him back to life. If your farmers have been pushed off the land, can they go back to their land? Like in NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada, Mexico, and the US, remember you have to remove your subsidies on the US farm products, but you remove your tariffs on the US products, but the US keeps their subsidies. So for Mexico, it was corn, not rice. And so they removed their subsidies on US corn. They removed their tariffs on US corn. The US kept their subsidies. The US corn was so cheap into Mexico that 1/3 of the farmers went bankrupt, lost their land. could not compete with the US corn, it was so cheap. So sure, you can withdraw from NAFTA, but what happens to all the farmers who lost their jobs? What happens to the industries that collapsed? What happens to the patients who died with no medicine? Some things are very hard to reverse. So yes, in theory you can, but we don't see it in practice. We see a lot of countries decide not to sign, but once they are in, we don't see them get out. Malaysia can always be first, but it hasn't happened so far. Malaysia boleh kan? Yeah.
Can investors sue Malaysia if Malaysia decides to withdraw?
Ha.
Within those 6 months?
Yes, good question, but I think from memory in the investment chapter they have a 6-month waiting period. So they start to sue and they're supposed to consult and negotiate before the actual suing takes effect. So I think they'd be 1 day late if they did it the next day. And there is a complication about Malaysia's existing investment treaties often have what we call survival clauses, that even when you withdraw, they can still sue for another 5, 10, 15, 20 years, which is what happened to some of the Latin American countries. Thank goodness the survival clause is not in the TPP. But for example, say Malaysia opened certain sectors in the TPP, right? We opened mining, bauxite mining, uranium mining, I don't know what kind of mining, right? Because forced to open them to foreign investors in the TPP. Then we got a new bauxite mine license given to an American. Then Malaysia withdraws from